So do you think that nice guy is a good way to describe Jesus? So let's investigate this a little bit. So Jesus is the Son of God. God is love. Therefore, Jesus is love, an all-loving being. So he's more than nice guy. He's the personification of love. Now, people have different perspectives about what it means to be a loving person, okay? So some think that Jesus was like super nice all the time. I mean, with his long hair, he's a little hippie-like, okay? So he's meek and easygoing, live and let live, totally tolerant, and mild-mannered. What do you think? We got a lot of people shaking their heads. No, you're exactly correct. There's none of this, all right? So there's nothing wimpy or soft about Jesus, even though he's the personification of love. So when Jesus saw something that went contrary to love, it just grated him. So the God of love hates sin and evil. So for Jesus, when it came to wrongdoing, particularly if people were sneaky about it, he wasn't tolerant, mild, or easygoing, okay? So when Jesus was upset, he wouldn't hit you over the head with a 2x4, but he was an expert at verbally zinging people who were off course. Now, in this short gospel, Jesus is going to be approaching two different groups of people. He's going to be talking about the scribes, and he's going to actually have a subtle little jab that he's going to do to his own disciples. So let's start the first half of the gospel. Jesus' obvious target is the scribes. I don't know if you're up to speed on the scribes, all right? So the scribes, they're scripture scholars. They're very good experts in the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. Now, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, I think you know them, they're the Pentateuch. We also call them the Mosaic Law. So the Mosaic Law, they're going to be experts on the law, so they know the law, interpret the law, apply the law, so that makes them spiritual lawyers, the scribes who are scripture scholars. Now, these scribes are then high-ranking religious officials, and they love to parade around the temple. They love to tout themselves as being holy and trustworthy and virtuous and decent men. The question is, were they? Now, the people might have been fooled, but Jesus was not fooled. So Jesus says in so many words to his disciples, you got to watch out for these guys, the scribes. They like to strut around in their long robes. So is there anything wrong with long robes? I mean, judges wear long robes. You know, when you graduate, you get to wear a long robe. Today, our servers are wearing robes. Okay, our deacon is wearing robes. I'm wearing robes. Anything wrong with robes? The answer is no. But when it comes to the scribes, they wore long robes, and there was a problem because they wore their robes to show off. Then Jesus says they like titles of respect in public. So there are normal things that you would call a scribe. You'd call him rabbi. That's a title of respect. Okay, you could also call him teacher. I didn't know this until I was studying about this stuff. One of the titles they went by was, "Oh, great one." I mean, goodness gracious. Now, is there anything wrong with titles? You talk to a judge, Your Honor. A bishop, Your Excellency. You talk to your mom, Mother. You talk to Dad, Father. These are titles of respect. Anything wrong with a title of respect? No trouble whatsoever. But the problem on this deal is that the scribes insisted on titles of respect. They wanted to look really good in front of other people, and they used their title to show off. Okay, the next thing that Jesus says when he's complaining about them is he said they recite long prayers. Anything wrong with a long prayer? I mean, Jesus prayed for 40 days and 40 nights before he began his ministry. That's a long prayer. On Holy Thursday night, they go out to Gethsemane. He looks at his disciples and says, I would like for you to pray with me for 1 hour. We're going to pray for an hour. If you say the rosary, you got 15 or 20 minutes of prayer. Anything wrong with a long prayer? Nothing, okay? But we got a problem with the scribes when they do their long prayers because they did their long prayers as a public display to show off. So these guys are parading around as good guys, and they were show-offs. So Jesus, he's the personification of love. And he knows that these scribes, they're frauds. They're not genuine. And he wanted his people to know. So Jesus is telling his disciples in so many words, don't be fooled by them. They're stuck up and they're conceited and they're arrogant. Then Jesus has another very cutting remark. Pointing at the scribes, he said, they devour the houses of widows. That might not be apparent what that means. Houses means savings. They devour their money. Now, these lonely women, they had money because they had inherited it from their husbands, and they were lonely, and they were hoping for a little attention. And so these scribes, they were very slick operators, and they faked their concern for the widows and tricked these vulnerable women into giving them not donations to the temple, but personal donations. Jesus wanted to alert the widows and everybody, these scribes, it's all for show. They're greedy and selfish and swindlers, and they don't deserve a nickel. We could say they don't deserve a shekel, whatever, okay? So Jesus, he exposed the scribes for what they really were. In doing so, Jesus is making a very important instruction for his disciples. He's saying, don't you dare be like these scribes. Do not be a show-off. Do not be a fraud. Don't be stuck up, arrogant, and conceited. Don't be greedy and selfish. If you want to be my disciple, you have to be generous and you have to be humble. And the advice that Jesus was giving to those disciples applies to you and me today just as much as it did to them back then. Now, that's the first half of the gospel, and Jesus, the obvious target is the scribes. Now Jesus is going to call the disciples to himself, and now he's going to have a message for them, but it's going to be a little bit more subtle. So he sits the guys down, the 12 apostles. They're at a spot in the temple, and they can see the treasury. The treasury was along a wall, and it had little baskets along it, so you could watch how this was happening. So the rich people come along, and they're putting in these large donations, but they had plenty left over. Jesus is very careful to point out that they had money left over. Then the woman comes. Now, she's not wealthy like the other widows with the houses and the savings. She doesn't have hardly anything, so she puts a couple of coins in the basket. Then Jesus said that she gave everything she had, her entire livelihood. This is amazing, the comment that Jesus is making about the woman. She gave everything she had without holding back, and they should go, and those wealthy people, they gave and they did hold back. And he's got an eye to his disciples because he knows that they're going to hold back. So get a load of this. There's a very striking comparison going on here. Jesus is comparing the widow to himself, and he's comparing the wealthy donors to the disciples. So the widow is going to give her whole life without holding back. Jesus is going to give his whole life without holding back. And the disciples, after all they've been given, they're going to give some to Jesus, but they're going to hold back. See, Jesus knows what's going to happen on Holy Thursday night and Good Friday. When Jesus is arrested, the disciples, they fled. They held back. They were afraid. On Good Friday morning, when Jesus was on trial, the disciples weren't there. They could have been witnesses on his behalf. They held back. They were afraid. Then on Good Friday afternoon, at the foot of the cross, you've got Mary and the beloved disciple. The 12 apostles, they're gone in hiding. They held back. They were afraid. Jesus was disappointed in advance that he knew his disciples would hold back. And they failed to comprehend that you have to give your life to save it. So Jesus has these very important words of instruction for his disciples. The widow gave everything. I'm going to give everything. And if you're going to be my disciple, you cannot hold back. You have to give everything as well. Now, my friends, this is a short little gospel. Jesus here is not meek. He's not easygoing. He's not mild-mannered. He has two really strong messages that he wants you and me to go home with today. Message number one. Do not be like the scribes. Do not be a show-off. Do not be a fake or a fraud. Don't be conceited and arrogant. Do not be greedy and selfish. Please, please be humble and generous. And message number 2, if you want to follow me, there is no holding back. You have to be willing to give your entire life for me.